You can't lie in sport, you can't spin it in sport, you're either doing it or you're not. The idea of doing exactly the same event just to win the race again has very limited appeal for me. It's got to be hard and different enough. It's got to be sort of growing on that. What would I do if nobody ever knew?
Okay.
Be valued because of who you are, not because of what you do.
From what you've seen, how do you define great leadership?
I think people confuse great leadership with technical competence. So you can be incredibly good at your job, but not necessarily good at leading others. Great leadership is the quiet confidence to be able to imagine a different future. Don't ever look at somebody else who's on a podcast and think, well, they've figured it out and I've not. There is no end game. There is no point in time where you've figured it all out.
How important Nikki being and the role she plays?
I think it's harder to be left than to leave. Nikki and I have almost nothing in common. If we were modern meeting on online dating, this whole idea of matching interests, we would have never met.
If you could go for a coffee with one leader and pick their brains for a couple hours, who would it be and what would you ask?
I think I'd quite like to sit down with Trump.
Mark, thank you so much for joining me.
It's great to be here.
It's really good to have you on. I think I met you for the first time 6 months ago, and you said a specific sentence to me that made me realise, okay, I really am speaking to a top performer, an endurance athlete here. You said the sentence, "When I cycled around the world for the second time," and then finished the end, I was like, okay, this is the conversation I definitely want to have. So it's a real pleasure to have you today. And as things stand, we're at the time of recording, we're in the middle of January. You're a couple of weeks away from your next big adventure.
Yeah, so next Thursday, I fly out to Santiago to climb a mountain that I've climbed before, 𝐷 It's the highest volcano on the planet, just shy of 7 kilometers up. So people will be familiar with 𝐌𝐚𝐫𝐤𝐿, which is the highest peak in the Western Hemisphere. 𝐷 is the second highest. Okay. Nobody's ever heard of the second highest, but the reason we go there is because it's a less technical climb. It's a big scree mountain, and the mission is to run a marathon off the summit. Wow. So a world record attempt of the world's highest marathon. So a mountain I know well. It's a beautiful climb. It's not hard, but it's very, very high. Last time I was there, I was in a crew of 6. Only 3 of us made it to the summit. But the idea of then running off the summit is, it's beyond anything I've done before in terms of, you've joined me on a few runs already.
Trying to keep up,
but this will be into a different space, and I'm going with an amazing organization called Becoming X. And Becoming X, the whole purpose of Becoming X is about becoming extraordinary and trying to encourage everyone to think about what are the things that they can do in their lives to take on what they might perceive as extraordinary things. Yeah. And so there's a lot of the group who are going to Chile who are amateurs who have never done anything like this before, and it'll be for myself and Aldo Kane and a few of the other professionals to try and support and encourage these people to this extraordinary feat. So it's hard enough for us, but we're also taking people who have never been in that environment before, taking on something truly, truly difficult.
Amazing. What's the overriding emotion in your mind right now?
I'm excited.
Yeah,
it's a new year. There's a lot to look forward to. I'm keen to get started. Yeah. I'm keen to get out there. I've got a huge responsibility for not just the rest of the team, many of whom don't have the same level of expeditionary experience, but also the opportunity and responsibility around the storytelling. Yeah. It's one thing going and doing these things. It's another thing having a platform to then being able to inform and inspire. Yeah. And everything I do these days is not so much about pushing myself, although I enjoy doing that within my projects. Yeah. But it's about informing and inspiring others. So whether it's investing in, life-changing science and technology companies, or putting out content around endurance and sports, or working with great third sector organisations across Scotland, everything for me has to have that wider purpose of how can I support other people with my network and lived experience to do something. Because I think, like most people in life, you spend the first chapter of your career trying to figure out what you're capable of.
Yeah.
And then you maybe use the next chapter of your career, once you've built that security in every sense of the word, to say, well, how do I build an engine room for doing that? But within wider networks, that could be, work, family, community, all of these things. So I'm excited. I'm one of these people that likes to punctuate time. I don't like to just exist. So I can think back over the last 20 years of my adult life and go, every year counted for something. There was a story.
Yeah, brilliant.
There was some full stops, there was some commas, there was some semicolon. But my point being, there was specific projects and deliverables for every period of my life. And that's the way I like to think about things. And going to Chile with this amazing group is going to be a significant chapter this year.
Sure, yeah. And again, from the incredible, expeditions you've done, there's a real element of leading yourself and then leading others as well. And you've had exposure to high performance, high pressure, and great leadership, and probably the reverse and the poor of everything as well. But for you, from what you've seen, how do you define great leadership?
Great leadership has to start with lived experience. So that's not to suggest you have to know everything, but the credibility to know what you're asking people to do. Great leadership, and I think people confuse great leadership with technical competence. So you can be incredibly good at your job, but not necessarily good at leading others. I remember when I was a teenager and I went to become a ski instructor, a number of the people on the course failed, not because they weren't good skiers, because they didn't understand what they did well enough to be able to communicate it with others. And that really stuck with me. I was 18 at the time, doing my instructor's exams, and I thought, these are phenomenal skiers, but they don't understand what they do in a way that could possibly help others. And so they didn't become instructors.
Yeah.
And that's really stuck with me. So great leadership is the quiet confidence to be able to imagine a different future. You've got to have the foresight and the ability to imagine a different future. You've got to have the lived experience to know the component parts of what you're trying to do. So what behaviors could you do differently that would create a different outcome? And then you've got to be able to communicate it. So that's not to say within what I've just explained that you need to be able to understand all of the parts.
Yeah.
I've always described my role in all of my projects as the architect, not the builder. And the architect tells you what the building should look like. And then you rely on great tradespeople to deliver on that vision. So leadership, and I'm not pretending I get it right all the time, this is the theory of leadership I'm talking about, is having the quiet confidence to imagine what that's going to look like. The depth of understanding to understand what skill sets you need to deliver on that vision, and then to be able to communicate it. And I'd say there's a massive difference between knowing how to do something yourself and being able to, build that, collective, that team to be able to do something. And I think a lot of people fail in leadership because they think, well, it's just about me being brilliant.
Great, yeah, 100%. Yeah, and that's so common, isn't it? That people think they need to have all the answers, whereas the great leaders are the ones that are self-aware enough and aware of the people around them to actually realise that there's smarter people in the room in different domains.
Yeah.
And being able to bring them to the front and having that, being able to take people with you on that journey.
And again, I want to be able to chat about these ideas on this podcast without pretending that I'm always getting it right or have all the, I always have success with these things. It's just simply the way I think about it.
Yeah.
In the Western world, we have an education system where you're valued for what you can remember and what you can solve for. And, the Western way of thinking is interesting because we often look up to people. We wait for, our exams to be marked, our parents to approve us. We live in a system where young people in particular, their value is, I say, what they can problem solve and what they can remember. And we need to have that as a baseline education system.
Yeah.
But that is not your value in life, especially in an AI tech-enabled world. Yeah. So we need to think pretty quickly about what our roles in society are. And to get beyond if you go through life waiting for other people to approve your working or mark your working or give you license to back your own ideas, then you're going to spend your entire life in a sort of a teacher pupil mindset or a parent child mindset. Leadership for me is that quiet confidence to imagine a different future and to create it. When I was in my first couple of years of my career in my early 20s, I worked under the great late David Peat. David Peat was a legend in the Scottish filmmaking world. He was a filmmaker and documentary maker. I worked with him for the last 7-8 years of his life and career in BBC Scotland. Mm-hmm. Filmed all over the world with him. He was a great friend and a real gentle guy. Had a great love for storytelling. I went into television to give return on investment to my sponsors. I didn't really go into it with any interest in the creative side of filmmaking. Mm-hmm. And it was David Peat who shared that love for filmmaking. And David said to me probably when I was 23, 24, mm-hmm. he said, Mark, in life, be valued because of who you are, not because of what you do. And when I was that age, soon out of university, I had no idea what that meant, because my value was, my degree, the things I had on my CV. Be valued because of who you are, not because of what you do. Well, the entire social construct that we have is you're valued, because of the things that you studied and the things that you can do technically. It's much, much harder to put your finger on your value because of who you are. Mm-hmm. Having moral confidence, being able to communicate, mm-hmm. being able to engage with projects outside of the things that people ask you to do. Mm-hmm. So if it's about going to work and doing work and then going home, that's fine. But if you take all of who you are and all your skill sets and you take that into different walks of life, mm-hmm. and you're creating value within your family, within your community, you're creating connections for people. I love this idea of surplus value. When you're a child, you take more than you give. You create a mess in your bedroom that gets tidied up for you. It costs to put you through education, and you're a net beneficiary. Mm-hmm. As you're young, and you're quite rightly taking time, resource, and everything to create the young person that you are. Yeah. And then once you become an adult, can you be somebody who creates surplus value? Mm-hmm. So you tidy up for other people more than they tidy up for you. You create more opportunities for others than they create for you. You create net wealth for other people as well as looking after yourself. That net surplus idea, and not to be mean about this, but some adults go through their entire life thinking, what can I get? Mm-hmm. What can I take from the system? What can I get from the system? Yeah. And if you stop and think about being valued because of who you are, not because of what you do, and you're no longer just transacting because you're a lawyer, you're a doctor, you're a policeman, whatever that is, then you start to get to this point of, well, life is just time, mm-hmm. life is relationships, and if I can, of course, look after myself and those around me, but ultimately, can I, through everything that I'm doing, use the time that I've got mm-hmm. to create surplus value? Now, of course, that's wonderfully self-interested, because the more you sort of put arrows out into the world, the more those arrows come back to yourself. And that's a useful conversation when it comes to mental health as well. But that simple idea of being valued because of who you are, and as an adult, growing into the space where you create net value, you're doing more for the world than you look for the world to give to you. That's a useful framework. Now, I don't want this to sound, preachy, and I don't want it to sound like I've got it all figured out, but it's simply the framework that I try and think about these things.
Of course. As I would define it, I would call you an outlier, in terms of you've done extraordinary things in terms of performance, endurance, now in business as well. you talked earlier on around those formative years and, and childhood as well. And I've heard you talk a little bit about this before, but when you think about your childhood, what are some of the core memories that you reflect on that you almost now see attaching to who you are now and what you've done over the last 20 years in very much the public eye?
When you're a child, it's all that you know.
Yeah.
So you don't have much of a reference point as to what quote unquote normal is. My childhood, looking back at the age of 43, was an outlier. Most children are not homeschooled on an organic farm, brought up on homeopathic medicine. My friendship group as a child were my two sisters. I had brief interactions with some kids on the neighbouring farms and some other homeschooled kids, but really didn't know that many people until I was into high school. So I transitioned into school in high school. Being brought up on a farm and being homeschooled, my day-to-day life was an hour or two around the kitchen table doing subjects. You don't need to go to primary school to learn to read and write. If the sum total of your primary school experience is to then go into senior school and being able to get by in terms of reading books and doing sums and all the rest of it, it doesn't take 7-8 hours a day or however long kids are in school. It's a construct so adults can go to work.
Yeah.
But even saying that sounds controversial, doesn't it? But I mean, it's true. It's just the society we live in. If you think about anything in life, like how long does your mortgage term or anything in life, it's a construct to work within the way we've defined society.
Social norms, yeah.
Exactly. So it's worth just stopping and thinking, well, why do we do that? Do we do that because 5-year-olds need to sit for that long every day, or do we just need them looked after? Having the freedom I had, milking 60 goats every morning, collecting eggs from 200 hens and mucking out horse boxes, gave me a great work ethic.
Of course.
So I definitely had a work ethic from my childhood.
Yeah.
It gave me a bit of an outsider's perspective.
Yeah.
But you don't know any of these things.
Sure.
I only know these things now that I've got a 12-year-old and a 9-year-old and we live in a city, and I look back and go, wow, that was different. And looking back, it looks like a complete sort of Swallows and Amazons, sort of Enid Blyton type childhood. I mean, I might as well have grown up in the Victorian times. There was a lot of positives to it. There was some negatives. I'm not sure I would do the same, but that's life. But if I had the ability from those formative years to then have the quiet confidence to back my own ideas and the things that I've done, of course, I think they come from life on the farm, life where I wasn't in a playground being told that this is the way you do things. Having said all of that, I've got two sisters and they don't necessarily think the way I do. They don't have my politics. They're not entrepreneurial. They've got amazing jobs. They do incredibly well. One's a midwife and one's an educational psychologist. So nature, nurture. I've got a lot to thank for the freedoms that I was given in the first 10, 12 years of my life. But I don't think just because you are given that environment, you're going to end up in the same place.
A lot of people almost forget that the first leadership you see in front of your own eyes is your parents. When you look back now, what are some of the behaviours or, the way your parents brought you up and talked to you and led you in those years? How did that kind of look and feel?
A lot of the independent thinking came from my mum's side. It's hard to really know because children receive this, but they're not part of the thought process. My dad's family wasn't from farming stock. My grandfather was a successful optometrist. He had a chain of glasses shops. And my dad went on a summer job, which he loved, and decided a bit of a whim off the back of that to become a farmer, which is not normal. Farming is something which normally sort of is in the family.
Generational, yeah.
So I guess that showed a bit of a maverick character, but I sense that a lot of the decisions in my childhood around the homeschooling, the alternative medicine was very much driven by my mum.
And what did that look like specifically? You say alternative medicine, what was that?
Well, just, don't go to the doctor, no vaccines, homeopathy.
Yeah.
Grew everything in the garden. Everything was very, very healthy.
Yeah.
To the point where I don't completely agree with all of that. I took a lot from it, and it gives you a great sort of inquisitive mind as to why do we do this.
Yeah.
But when I got mumps, as a 22-year-old, I wasn't thanking my parents at that point for not giving me a vaccine. And so I've definitely made different choices with my children.
Yeah.
It was also quite religious.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting that neither of my parents seem to have remained particularly Christian. Neither of them go to church now, but I was a church chorister. The Lord's Prayer it's quite old fashioned. So I felt that Christianity and religion in my childhood growing up was more a matter of tradition than faith.
Mm-hmm.
So everything that we did was probably informed by their childhood, especially my mum's childhood, more than deep-seated beliefs. But all of these things matter. They become those things that happen in the first 10 years of your life. Even though I've not held on to the specifics of some of them, my views on modern medicine, for example, or my views on religion, of course they're fundamental to the way you approach life in terms of your value sets and whether you're independently minded. Or my childhood was quite remote, and remoteness doesn't mean living in the countryside or the town. Remote means the community around you. I think we need people around us. Mm-hmm. And we were quite isolated. The big event a couple of times a year was when grandparents came to stay. Mm-hmm. There weren't a lot of friends. I didn't miss them because I had my sisters. Mm-hmm. We had the FAF, which was the Friends Army Force, which we used to chisel into the bark of trees.
Yeah.
So none of this is a sob story. I had an amazing childhood. It does seem like a very, very different world now that I live in Edinburgh with my daughters, living a completely different existence than I did. And I sort of think back to my parents when they were my age now, 43, and I think, wow, some of the decisions that you were making around how you lived your life and brought up your children, it was pretty bold, pretty tough, really tough. I mean, I think in a business sense, having a really small organics farm, a 60-acre organic farm in the 80s and 90s must have been, you don't think about these things when you're a child, but those were tough decisions, sure, really tough decisions. So I've got a lot of respect. I've certainly not copied most of it. Is it the fabric of who I am? Yeah, of course. And then I'm very proud in my adult life. My parents divorced when I was 16. My mum then worked with me in the business for most of my 20s and 30s. She's retired now. But it was wonderful to go from being, brought up by my mum and homeschooled by her to then flipping the script and her helping me build my business. We always called her base camp. So even though I built these big teams and big performance teams, it was always nice to have family at the heart of it.
Amazing. Yeah, for sure. And that, a lot of what you say resonates with me, maybe not quite on such a remote or rural scale, but I grew up in a tiny little hamlet in the Scottish borders with myself and my brother, who was your best friend and your biggest enemy. So it's like you'd go from having a fight, 1 minute, and then half an hour later, you're outside playing football again because that's your only friend you've got next to you.
Yeah.
And I think, certainly now we both live in Edinburgh, but we love going back to home. We're fortunate our parents are still there and been able to reattach ourselves, and now we've both got kids and letting them see some of that. Maybe the biggest example in your journey where, again, this theme of being an outlier came when you were 12 years old and you cycled across the country on a bike as a 12-year-old. How does that start? How does that come about?
I'd read about somebody who had cycled Land's End John O'Groats in the Courier in the local paper, and I actually wanted to do that, but I had no reference point as to how far that was.
Okay.
So it was my mum that said, why don't you try something smaller first? So we cooked up the idea of cycling across Scotland from Dundee to Oban. It was a 3-day mission, 45 miles a day for 3 days. First day to Aberfeldy, second day to Cranelagh, third day to Oban, starting at Discovery Point Dundee. And I mean, at the age of 12, that's not that mad. You know, I look back now and I think, well,
maybe that's the first example of your mindset compared to most, in terms of what most 12-year-olds are doing in the city and towns.
It's 45 miles a day. So my 9-year-old recently cycled 100 kilometers.
Yeah.
So I mean, the children are well capable of these things.
Of course, yeah.
So what you can do and what you're capable of doing versus what you actually do is clearly two very different things.
For sure.
And as adults, we put huge limitations on our own children based on our own fears and expectations. So when Willa, my 9-year-old, recently cycled the canal paths from Glasgow to Edinburgh, I gave her the option to get on the train at 2 or 3 points along the way. And she is quite determined and she wanted to keep going and prove that she could do it. So after 7 hours and 40 minutes, you know, we pedalled home and she did it. And Nikki, my wife, pointed out that because she would find it incredibly difficult to cycle 100 kilometers, she probably wouldn't let her children do it. But because that's well within my, you know, my range,
yeah,
I was very comfortable to allow my 9-year-old to explore that for herself.
Amazing.
And so I think it would be very, very easy to make that decision for a child and say, well, don't be silly. And then their world becomes defined by what your expectations of them are. And so when the greatest sort of compliment I can pay my parents was they backed my ambitions. They're not sporty. They certainly didn't have these ambitions, but they never said no. Yeah. And my mum's superpower, even when she worked with me and for me in my 20s and 30s, she never put her mum hat on. With all these global expeditions to 130 nations and territories and all the dangers of going through war zones and the middle of the oceans and the high altitude stuff in the Arctic, she never put her mum hat on and said, Mark, I don't want you to do this. Mm-hmm. She just did her job, got on with it, respected that by that point in my career, I had way, way, way more experience than she did. Mm-hmm. She was an important part of the team. I respected her opinion, but she would never say, I want you to do different things differently at 6,000 meters or in the middle of the Atlantic or wherever you are, because that's not an environment she knows. So respecting your kids when they've got a depth of understanding that you don't, I think must be incredibly difficult as a parent. And I'm seeing that now as my daughters grow up. So to back me to cycle across Scotland at the age of 12 is not that difficult from a sporting perspective. I think the reason that you find it interesting is because it's not something that a lot of kids do. You know, they'd be playing football with the club at the weekend, being active and sporty, but not necessarily going out on a limb and doing something which is a mini expedition. And I was transitioning into school for the very first time. And the reaction, getting my story in the paper and handing over a £2,000 charity cheque to Princess Royal, and small events that happened around the cycle, forget the actual 135 mile cycling, that was probably more important. Mm-hmm. The storytelling, the fact that as I went into high school, I wasn't a footballer or a rugby player or anything else, but I had this thing that was mine. That identity piece was what I latched onto the most. If it had been art, if it had been whatever else, I would have latched onto that. Kids need purpose. They need an identity. They need something that's theirs. And for me, it was, as a homeschooled, slightly lost kid going into high school, I'd done this adventure and I'd raised some money for charities. So of course I wanted more of that. It gave me recognition. It gave me identity. By the time I was 15 and I was soloing Land's End, John O'Groats Land's End, and then got bigger and bigger and bigger, it was just a continuation of the same. So you can sort of look back and say, well, it all looks rather inevitable. But that's not how you live your life. You live your life by going, that's the hardest thing I've ever imagined, let's do that. And then once you've done that, you go, well, that unlocks the next level. And I think most people's careers are like that, where they pursue an interest for very personal reasons. They get a level of recognition for doing that. That feels good. And on you go. Yeah, for sure. You hear a lot of people talk that are, you know, high achievers, whether they're Premier League football players or athletes, just won multiple gold medals, and they always get to the end of their career and they say, I wish I just enjoyed it a bit more in the moment, because it's always that next one, and the next 4-year cycle.
in those moments where you've achieved things that nobody else on the planet has achieved, are you able to enjoy yourself and celebrate? And if so, how long does that last before you're on to the next one in terms of what you're going to do next to push yourself even further?
I think it's impossible when you're at the finish line of whatever big project you've taken on. It could be selling your business or cycling around the world, because you're in it, because you're living it, because you're shouldering the responsibility to actually do it. The greatest emotions around completing are relief, and if you've got a team around you, gratitude. If you've run a marathon, when you're on the finishing line, you don't jump up and down for joy. You're relieved.
Yeah.
So the objective bit, so what you imagine that you'll jump up and down and do backflips and feel euphoric, but that's it's great that we've got that ability to visualize what it'll be like. You know, we reward ourselves with that future self. We go, well, this is what it'll be like. And it's so important that we can do that, because it would be hard to stay motivated when it's really tough if you didn't have that future self that you were imagining. The fact that when you get there, it's impossible to be objective to high pressure completion points.
Yeah.
You're in it. That's okay. So I think people often say, well, that's a bit sad. I wish I was at ground level and at 30,000 feet at the same time. I think it's a missed point to feel conflicted about not celebrating the way you think you will. Mm-hmm. I think it's great that we have the ability of foresight. It's the thing that separates us from the rabbits. We can imagine a different future. We can think about, how we're going to make our lives a bit better and for those around us. That's great. Foresight's amazing. The fact that when you're then delivering that, and you've got the leadership and the responsibility to be at the heart of whatever that big moment is, it's impossible to be on the ground and at 30,000 feet. Mm. It's just a fact of life. The joy in that moment is that people are often celebrating for you. People around you who don't shoulder that responsibility do have the privilege of celebrating for you and on your behalf. I've stood at the finishing line at the Arc de Triomphe twice, having pedaled 18,000 miles, and everyone else looks a lot happier than I do.
Yeah.
I am sort of standing there going, oh my goodness, this is a point I've thought about 10,000 times, and now I'm here. Am I here? Is this real?
I saw that, and if anybody's not watched it, there's an incredible documentary documenting the entire journey over the 78 days on Amazon Prime. Go and watch it. And I thought that at the end as well, when you get to the Arc de Triomphe and everybody else is like unbelievable, and you can see it.
Yeah, but that's okay. I think that's okay. And I think it's odd that people, when you have those amazing moments of relief, those amazing moments of elation, that you then almost criticize the way you feel about it. Mm-hmm. Your authentic feelings in that moment, they are what they are. So to then feel saddened by the fact that they aren't what you expected, some things in life you just have to let go of and appreciate that if you've run a marathon, at the end you feel relief. Mm-hmm. Relief and pride in the reason you've done it and the people around you. And you could say the same for anything in life, and that's okay because you're an operator, you're in it. The fact then afterwards, it's quite natural to have a dip and a blue because you've lived your life in a process and a routine to get yourself to that point. Mm-hmm. You've had something to think about every day when you wake up, and then you retire or you've run your race and you stop training and your life no longer has structure. And of course you feel a bit lost. That again, but rather than feeling sad about that, acknowledge that if you lived your entire life in this sort of hyper-driven, hyper-focused space, you wouldn't have the light and the shade that you need in life. Mm-hmm. You need periods where you stop, reflect, let your mind sort of relax before you then sort of amp back up and focus on the next thing. What I find interesting about these conversations is people often speak in sort of tones of regret, like, why didn't I enjoy it more? Or why did I get sad afterwards? And these are really, really normal human emotions, and that's okay. Like if you're too in it to enjoy it, you know, have a wry smile and some humor about that. The fact that you might feel actually a bit depressed afterwards, as long as it doesn't become serious and you need help with it, you know, embrace it. Like, that's okay. I think we're meant to be happy, we're meant to be sad, we're meant to cry, we're meant to celebrate. We're not meant to live our lives, you know, 9 out of 10, 10 out of 10 all the time.
Yeah.
You know, the full tapestry of emotions is what we should do as human beings.
Yeah.
And just because something isn't what you expect it to be doesn't mean it's wrong.
Yeah. I think that's sometimes the danger of overplaying the metaphor from sport to business, because those top athletes are in cycles of actually going through training blocks and off-season things, and then they're getting to a peak and they're coming back down and building back up. Whereas like people talk around in the boardroom and quarter, how do you stay at that 8, 9, 10? And that's how burnout happens. And I think it's just sometimes reflecting on that. Like those the best of the best are not at that all the time.
And being that sort of focused all the time, you can be an incredibly driven person. You mentioned the word burnout. I don't think burnout is necessarily related to how hard you work.
Mm-hmm.
It, of course, in a well-being sense, it's about sleep, recovery, immunology, all the rest of it. But burnout is about relevance. It's about control. It's about feeling like what you do matters. What you think, what you say, what you do matters. And people can get incredibly disillusioned or lost because they're looking for validation rather than doing it for themselves, or they're getting the balance wrong with their family, or the pillars of who they are. So your pillars can be lots of things, you know, work, family, community, whatever those things in your life that matter. And if one of those pillars falls over, you better have another pillar, because if you don't have at least 3 pillars in your life, then your life is quite susceptible to burnout.
Mm-hmm.
Sport, physical activity is a very obvious antidote for people who work hard. So they drive that obsession into physical well-being. Clearly, if you then get an injury or you do it too much, it can become a real negative.
Yeah.
And I think that's why it's fundamentally important in all the things that you do to remember that burnout is not necessarily about the intensity of what you do. It's about feeling like you're in the driving seat for what you do. I would reflect on last year, 2025, and say that I wasn't as effective as I would like to be. And there was major projects in my life that weren't going well, because I had to make some really big decisions, tough decisions at the time, which afterwards have come with huge relief and a bit of an unlock in terms of my time, in terms of what I do next. But that's life. Don't ever look at somebody else who's on a podcast and think, well, they've figured it out and I've not. You know, as somebody who has the privilege of having conversations like this, there's a risk that you look at it and think, well, you've made it. There is no end game. There is no point in time where you've figured it all out.
Yeah.
You know, once you talk to people who have got profile, you talk to people who have got wealth, you talk to people who have things that you might aspire to, and they've all got their own stuff they're dealing with. Nobody's sitting there just in cruise control.
Yeah.
And I think that also gives you a huge amount of empathy when you're working with other people, because we're all egocentric and we're all trying to figure out how we remain effective within the things that we care about. So to bring it back to your phrase, burnout is where you lose that balance.
Mm-hmm.
You're working incredibly hard, but for whatever reason, it's not being validated. You don't feel like you're being effective. You feel like what you're doing is not working. I don't think it's actually to do with the hours you're working or what you're doing. Clearly, there can be very negative habits. You can be overtraining, overworking, whatnot. But it's normally to do with are your inputs relevant to the outputs? Is what you're doing creating the results that you want. And if there's a big difference, if there's a lack of correlation between effort and results, I think people just get pretty burnt out.
For sure. Yeah, that's great. And I think it'll be so helpful as well for people to think about. By the very nature of a lot of the things you've done, there's world firsts, there's world records. So in the face of things, they're the impossible for most people. I want to talk a little bit around almost the process of building the impossible, and from that, when that idea comes into your brain, and then the steps that you need to talk around to ultimately, and I've heard you say this a lot, is like the biggest part, or some of the hardest parts is just getting to the start line.
Yeah.
And that process of ideation through to building that team and the plan and everything, because it's so easy for people to just see or watch that documentary, on the face of it, it's just Mark Beaumont on a bike, but it's the huge machine and planning of the months and years that goes into that. So I'd love to just pick your brains a little bit more around that process.
Yeah. I mean, within any project in life, people have their own familiarity bias. So let's take cycling around the planet. You're a keen bike rider. You want to go for the ultimate. I was inspired by Ellen MacArthur sailing around the world, and back in 2005, it's the ultimate. How fast can a human being get around the planet? And most bike riders would just think of it as a bike ride. Your familiarity bias would be, I'll go to the garage, I'll hit the road, I'll train harder than I've ever trained, and I'll get out there and I'll figure out what's possible.
Mm-hmm.
My approach to any of these projects is, how do I think of everything that could be done differently that would get us around the planet faster than anyone's ever done it before? I'm well aware that I'm not the best bike rider. The fact that I've got the round the world record, length of Africa and others, is not because of my aerodynamics or my FTP.
Mm-hmm.
It's because of our entire plan. So you've got to be really aware of your own blinkers and your own familiarity bias when you build these project teams. And yeah, I'm 6'3" and 100 kilos. It's not my ability on the bike.
That's how they begat your size.
Yeah, exactly. That is a technical skill set, and clearly you need to be good at it. You can't be rubbish at riding a bike, but you can't rely on that. And I think most people approach projects in life just overly indexing on their own technical competence. I'm not saying that you should be utterly average and assume outlandish results, but don't assume that it's just based on your own technical competence. The other aspect, when you're selling a dream, the reason other people care is not the reason that you care. And the reason that getting any project to the start line is difficult is kind of goes back to what we were saying before around, it's very tempting to go through life waiting for other people to acknowledge us, waiting for other people to promote us, waiting for other people to mark our homework. If I was to rock up and say, I need to recruit a team, raise a bunch of money, build this project to pedal around the planet faster than anyone's ever done it before, the reasons that I care are not the same reasons that people that buy into my projects would care. So there's always three questions when you're building partnerships. Who cares? Why do they care? What's it worth? Who cares? Why do they care? What's it worth? Which is a very different thing to simply saying, this is what I need to make it work. So I always stop at the start of any project and say, how can I, if I've got an idea of doing something that's not been done before, building a business or doing an expedition, you then figure out who you need around you to make that success. You then need to resource it. You then need to tell the story. You can start to understand why getting to the start line in these projects is a lot more complicated than being the scientist or being the athlete or being the founder at the heart of it. And it's where most projects fail, because most people just go out into the world and say, I'm good at this. I want to do something extraordinary. Who's with me? And other people are always looking to that founder for the quiet confidence and the depth of understanding of what they do. you can't rock up to somebody you're employing or somebody that's going to fund you and look to them for the confidence. The confidence has to come from you. So the framing for any big project is, we are doing this and there's an opportunity for you to be a part of it. It's not, we need you to make this happen, otherwise it's never going to happen.
Yeah.
So you've got to start from that position of quiet confidence, even if you don't always feel it yourself. And then who cares, why do they care, and what's it worth? You then need to get very good at understanding what the value is for other people. I often think with my amazing teams that work with me, why would they care? Why would they work so hard? I'm the guy that gets to write the book, get my name out there, have the public profile for it. Why would you be working all hours of the day, 2 o'clock in the morning, suffering like hell?
Handing you a burrito.
Yeah. I mean, it's extraordinary what some of my teams will do for no profile, no recognition. Yeah, it's a job, but my goodness, there's easier ways to make a living than working for me. And it's interesting because some people have come and worked for me and said, I've read the books, I've seen the documentaries, I would love to be a part of this. And then they reflect that they like the certainty of the results. They like vicariously being part of the adventure once that story is written. But the uncertainty of creating it is not everyone's idea of fun. Now, I like to take people into that place and say, you're an important part of this and every part of the chain is important. But I have had people leave my project teams over the last 20 years saying, I think I prefer the results show than the actual reality. Or I thought I understood what you did because I read the book.
Yeah.
And of course, a book is you trying to capture what you did after the event as you sit there for half a year afterwards. It's not the uncertainty of actually delivering that. The Round the World in 80 Days took 2.5 years in the planning, 40 people in my team, 7-figure budget, and people thought we were nuts. There was no reference points in the history of cycling that you could actually pedal 240 miles a day every day for 2.5 months.
So how do you actually screen them and almost give yourself that confidence of you want these people by your side? How do you kind of stress test them before kind of day one turns up?
I don't think you can. I look for certain character traits. People have to have a good work ethic. I'm not a micromanager. People need to be self-motivated. They also need to be, and it's not a very corporate word, but they have to have a sense of mischief.
Yeah.
They have to have a wry smile when the chips are down.
Yeah.
They have to have a bit of soldier's humor. Your fondest memories from any big project, whether it's building a business or doing an expedition, is some of the hard miles.
Sure.
Anyone can enjoy it when things are going well. But I always look for that intrinsic ability to step forward rather than step back. Technical skill sets matter. But what I really, really value in my team is decision-making under pressure. So as you turn the heat up in a situation, as you stress people, and stress could be financial, it could be sleep debt, it could be anything, time pressure, the politics of the team, the social dynamics, could, whatever stress looks like, what I really look for, being valued for who you are, not for what you do.
Yeah, great.
How does the character consistency shine through in the individuals? The fact that you're technically good at your job is the low bar. But your ability to show up, be counted, for people to trust you, for you to remain relevant to the challenge in high pressure situations, that's what you're looking for. And you try not to throw people in the deep end, and you try to create situations and environments where people can learn. There's also really important conversations about feedback loops and education, because when things are going wrong, it's very, very easy to personalize it and to throw people under the bus. And I often encourage my leaders, where in any business or any project, the most important metric for success is time and efficiency. And often, to keep momentum, keep doing what you're doing, you can't have you want to minimize meetings, you want to minimize feedback loops, you want to minimize friction. So if your metric for success is this sort of sprint mentality around, this is what we said we'd do, can we do it within the time frame we've got, really holding yourself to account around time. In a leadership role, you quite often need to think, well, there's going to be mistakes made quite often, but it's water under the bridge because it's not relevant to our future. Whereas what's the stuff which is either systematically wrong or habitually wrong? And if it's going to continue to happen, how can we create more momentum in the future? So I'm always encouraging people in my leadership teams to not sort of nitpick every issue, not to look for perfection, but just to focus on momentum and accountability. And if you can deliver success and really speed up the process of what you're doing, you become very, very precise about what you're actually trying to correct. You're not trying to correct everything. You're not looking for perfection. You're just trying to constantly make people more relevant to what they're doing, and being okay in the fact that we're allowed to sort of sit there on a Friday evening with a glass of wine and sort of talk about what this perfect workflow would look like. But life in practice is messy, and being okay with that. And the way that other people are going to see your successes is very, very, very different from how you actually lead life.
For sure.
And so I think being accepting of that is why I struggle with a lot of sort of theory of productivity and theory of leadership, because the practice of that is a lot less aspiring for perfection and a lot more focused on just accountability and time, and just making sure that when people join my teams, they know that it's going to be a trusting process at the end of the day. There's a hell of a lot that I don't know, so I'm really assuming that people bring skill sets to the party that I don't have.
Yeah.
And I'd say, to go back to the start of the conversation, the one thing that I can do is give people that sort of big picture view on, we're trying to create a different future. This is exciting and purposeful. We need everyone to show up and be relevant to that. Otherwise it's not going to work. And that creates a real sense of pride and excitement in the team.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's, a lot of people in business or in sport or just everyday life, like, you talk around what you're then going to be doing. Like, the biggest competitor they've usually got is the voice in their own head that talks them out of doing things. And, you know, I run my own business. I've kind of dipped my toe into the world of endurance now. We're doing some ultra running and longer term biking as well. And there's those moments when you're in your 4th or 5th mile of a training run or whatever, and you're kind of like, oh, I just want to get to the end of this. But to take you into, again, you've done numerous different expeditions, but the one that's well documented, you know, you're riding, I think it was 16 hours a day, every day, for 78 days, and I think you're cycling on average about 250 miles.
Yeah.
And take me into your own head there in terms of those dark moments and how you're just persevering and showing that resilience and managing that self-talk.
We set off around the world having tested the plan with a 3,000-mile training ride around the coastline of Britain. And the team took a lot of confidence from that because they got to know what that daily routine looked like and felt like it was a real stepping stone to the world. I felt like I was the only person after the Round Britain training ride who had lost belief in the plan, or the only person who doubted me was me, because we hadn't hit that magic 240 miles a day average. And you don't need to be an endurance bike rider to understand how averages work. You know, to make a 240 average, you've got to be able to ride through it regularly.
Yeah.
240 is not your best day, it's your average day. So it's very easy to have a bad day and do a 210. But then what? Are you going to do, you know, a 270 the next day to average that out? So that becomes pretty massive within a single day, to then get recovery to do the same again the next day. Anyone can do a silly one-day effort. Can you do it for 2.5 months? The most important thing with the Round the World in 80 days, that is, I mean, yes, it's a Victorian fiction, it's the Phileas Fogg, but could you actually get a human being around the planet in less than 80 days under their own steam? And that record will be broken. It's not been broken yet. There's at least 3 people vying for that record. But to be the first to go sub 80 was such a burning goal. And the previous record was 123 days, held by Andrew Nicholson, a New Zealander and Olympian. But with respect to Andrew, I wasn't trying to break the 123-day record. We were trying to be the first to go sub 80. So with that singular goal, sitting on the red sofa, BBC Breakfast, and telling the world that we were going to be the first to go sub 80, we claimed it before we did it, which is important because you don't do these things by accident. And then holding myself and the team to account when we're out there, even if it went well on a given day, just stopping, living the routine. We always said if we faff for 5 minutes every time I get off the bike, that'll add a day to the world record. So just out of my bed at 3:30, on the bike at 4 times 4-hour sets a day, 5.5 hours sleep, up at 3:30, on the bike at 4, repeat, not 4:05. I banned the team from asking me how I felt. If it was Laura Penhall, my performance manager, that was fine because that's well-being. But
yeah,
I squashed this idea of we're going to do more if we feel good or we're going to do less if we feel bad. I said, unless it's a case of safety, how we feel doesn't come into what we do. Because if you jump through that escape hatch and start to say, well, everything's going really well, so let's go a bit further, or, we did well yesterday, so let's give ourselves an easier day, you're never going to hit your best possible number.
Yeah, okay.
You've got to own it. People often talk about turning up and giving it 100% every day. The reality is 100% one day is going to feel very different to 100% the next day, based on things that you control and things you don't control. So turning up and being relevant every day based on your recovery or externalities is a very different way of thinking about it, as opposed to I will be 100% effective every day. That's just not a very helpful lens to think through life. Sometimes just showing up is 100%.
Yeah. There's a part which I found really amusing, and I think you just stopped and there's a bit of small chat going on in the van, and then you get back on the bike and you're away and the camera kind of comes to you and you're just like, I don't get it. There's a bit of small chat going on, and like nobody's obsessed as I am about this. And it's like it just amused me, but just like that pure, just you're in the zone, and like it's just relentless.
Yeah, I mean the reality is, when you're doing these things professionally, it's very different than when you're an amateur. When you're an amateur, if you want to give up, that's fine, it's your prerogative. But when you've got a team around you, you've got sponsors, it's your job. And the fear of failure is massive. People always talk about, positive motivation. What about negative motivation? Negative motivation can be incredibly powerful. Fear of failure, it's not a bad thing.
Well, I was going to ask you about that, because you talked earlier on around when somebody crosses that marathon finishing line, it's relief. And that's because most people for the 16 weeks prior, they've been posting every Strava run and everything across their Instagram, and people know that they're doing it. I know that when I did the 110-kilometer run, I'd raised money for charity, and it was just, I cannot not finish this because I'm raising money for charity. What is your relationship with failure and the fear of it in those situations?
If I think back on my last 20 years, about a third of my projects have failed. But they've never failed because of a lack of a plan, and they've never failed because I've given up. They've failed because I've turned them back, but that's a conscious decision, normally related to safety, or we simply couldn't carry on because something else happened outside of our control. So I think you're going to have regret if you don't have the gumption or the planning to see something through. But if you fail because in the real world, especially when you're trying to do first and fastest, you're going into the unknown, that's okay. And when you're trying to do these very difficult things, just like when you're investing, you're only going to follow if people are doing what they said they would do. You're only going to carry on if it's safe to carry on. The safety element and the risk profile around what you're doing, and having the leadership to make those decisions, don't assume that other people will make those decisions for you. So I've turned back expeditions where everyone else on the team disagreed with my decision. human nature, you tend to sort of justify your decisions after the event, but I'm completely at peace with the decisions that I've made on expeditions because people came back safely and we can live to fight another day. The fact that other people who did not have that leadership decision, did not make that decision, or didn't agree with me, well, that's just life. You can't always have complete agreement. And when you're running a business and when you're on an expedition, it's not a democracy. People do not have equal voting rights and equal decisions because you've got different responsibilities based on the social dynamic of the group, but also you've got fundamentally different life experiences. And I'm trying to make the best decisions I can in these high pressure situations based on what I know. Would other people make different decisions? Sure.
Yeah, well, I think there's that sometimes everybody talks about grit in business, and I believe that sometimes grit can be glorified. And in your eyes, maybe you've kind of talked about it a little bit there, but when has almost grit or that relentless view of let's just continue anyway become reckless or dangerous?
It's a judgment call, isn't it?
Yeah. And
I've done very few races, so most of the projects I've done in the sporting world are expeditions where I'm going for a first or a fastest, so I'm rarely out there with others. So that's like doing a science experiment of one.
Yeah.
Whereas when you're doing events that lots of other people are in, at least you've got a reference point. You've got so one that I did with others was a reaction to the COVID lockdown, and I was a Shimano ambassador for many years, and they asked me to do 𝘠𝐵 𝘠𝑗uro, which is a gravel race the length of Britain. So it's 2,000 kilometers, about 75% of it's off-road. Land's End John O'Groats off-road. 60 start places, and you've got to be selected to race this. And by the time we got to John O'Groats, 13 people finished.
Okay.
And I found that fascinating because that wasn't me out there on my own or with a team. That was me in an event where all of us had the skill set, all of us had been chosen to do this, all of us knew the task ahead of us, and yet somewhere along that long and winding road, 47 people stopped riding their bikes and 13 made it to the finish. And if you had told me on the start line that 13 out of 60 would finish, would have I been able to pick out the 13? Not a chance. Because it wasn't defined by age or, you know, whether they were male or female or shape or size or even fitness. It was a real mixed bag. When we got to John O'Groats, it was fascinating to see who had the grit to see through that 2,000 kilometer race. Is there a bit of luck? Sure. You need that in there in the mix. But it gave me a completely different perspective on the difference between the want to do it, the technical skill set to do it, and the staying power to actually see it through. Because 47 people, their bikes didn't break. They didn't get ill, maybe one or two. But at some point along that long and winding road, 47 people stopped riding the road in front of them. And I think that's such a powerful metaphor for life. You can almost always ride the road in front of you. I think what scares the hell out of people in business, in life, in marriage, and is the unseen road. Is the bit that you can't actually affect today. It's the idea of continuing to do this tomorrow, next week, next month, next year, and in 10 years' time. So if you think, well, I can always ride the road in front of me, do I feel like I'm in control? Do I feel fulfilled by what I do? Well, those are very relevant questions. But you can almost always ride the road in front of you. But most people stop riding the road in front of them because of the length, the sheer endurance of the unseen road. So I found it fascinating on 𝘠𝐵 𝘠𝘠𝘠𝑗uro, reflecting on who made it to the finish and why over half the field didn't. Because they all had the want, they all had the dream.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I don't know if you know or have heard 𝐷𝑒 𝘠𝑚𝑚 talk at all. So she's one of the world's most accomplished ultramarathoners. And she talks about how talks about being in the pain cave, which a lot of people kind of use that language, but she talks about specifically when she's going into that next 250 or 300 mile running race, of like when she hits that dark spot of not having slept for 2 days, it's all right, I've been in this part of the cave before, I just need to keep, I've got my axe, I just need to keep digging, because the next time I'm in it, in the next 6 months or a year, I will have been here before. For you, in those moments, what would be kind of an example of that, where you've been in a really, really dark place and maybe had that element of self-doubt, but you've also had the confidence of you've kind of been here before, and you've got that, you've built the kind of calluses, if you like, in your mind?
I think it's hugely helpful. Life experience beyond the 10. I mean, there's a theme, isn't there, here? That life experience is hugely, hugely helpful, because maybe it goes back to that anecdote I told about Willa going for a 100-kilometer cycle, because that's well within my comfort zone. I had the ability to do that easily and support my 9-year-old to fulfill a huge ambition for her. Whereas if I was a dad who myself struggled to cycle 100 kilometers, I probably wouldn't have the capacity to look up, look out, and support her through that. And you could amplify that for anything in life, couldn't you? I've done that so many times in my life that's a walk in the park, to the point where I can support her to do something like that. And if you're completely at the edge of your ability, you've never done it before, of course you're more likely to fail, because you don't have a reference point for it. Whereas that familiarity, I wrote a book 3-4 years ago called The Complete Guide to Cycling Psychology with Dr. Jim Taylor, and I'm not a psychologist, but I spent 6 fascinating months working with him to try and understand the language around mindset and goals and self-talk. And he brought that academic understanding, having worked with some of the world's best athletes, US ski team and triathlon and the rest of it. And what I found fascinating working on the psychology book was that difference between understanding the theory and having that lived experience. And in the opening paragraphs of the book, it says, I hope you enjoy this. I hope it helps you think about how you take on hard things in life, but none of it's really going to make sense until you're out there and you go, wow, this is really helpful, because I've now got a framework to think about this, because that's the lived experience bit. The converse of what you're saying is, sometimes when you have those sort of calluses in the mind, you don't want to go back there. You don't need to go back there.
Yeah.
I definitely got to the point in my career where I'd done so much ultra endurance time trialing. I broke the North Coast 500 record around the top of Scotland 4 years ago now. 28 hours, 34 minutes. So I was time trialing, sitting in that aero position for 28 and a half hours. I had to sit 270 watts normalized power for over a day. And about halfway through that ride, I was committed to finishing it. I was riding on that number, but I sort of promised myself, I don't need to do this again. I've done this a number of times now. I know what this feels like. This is hard. This is truly difficult, but I'm not sure what I'm learning about myself. So there's got to be that sort of element of learning an unknown each time. The idea of doing exactly the same event just to win the race again has very limited appeal for me. So whilst, of course, you lean on different experiences you've got in your life to be able to sort of leapfrog into new spaces, and that gives you a huge amount of sort of confidence in these environments, I don't think I'm the sort of person that would just go back because it's hard in and of itself. It's got to be hard and different enough. It's got to be sort of growing on that. If it was just, I've definitely been to places a few times, rowing the Atlantic's another good example, where I'm like, that's amazing, I've learned from it. Do I need to do it again? No. So there's certain suffering that you can just sort of put to bed, learn from it, and say, well,
What's it's maybe the most obvious question people listening are wanting to ask, but I'm really intrigued about your why and how that's maybe changed over the last 20 years. Because I think that's, whether you're running a business or part of a business, the teams that are most successful are the ones that are attached to that bigger purpose and that why. What's that overarching why for you, and how's that maybe kind of changed over the course of your career?
You say it's the obvious question. It's probably the hardest question.
Yes.
How you're wired up and how you're motivated is quite a hard thing to analyze yourself. I've always been, like most people, motivated by my own family. How can, within my relatively narrow technical skill sets and the application of my work as an investor, as an athlete, as a broadcaster, as an advisor, how within those fields can I affect broader themes that I'm concerned about? Mm-hmm. Young people, climate change and sustainability, the society that I'm a part of. I'm reading the book at the moment, Moral Courage, which is really interesting. And I'm very, very interested how you take narrow technical skill sets and make them relevant to causes outside of your own domestic affairs and financial security and the rest of it. So I don't think that's massively changed. Mm-hmm. Here's an odd way of answering your question. If the sum total of my ambition in life was to pay the mortgage and have a pension pot, I clearly wouldn't have done what I've done. Yeah. There's easier ways to make money.
Certainly.
I've always been motivated by taking on projects that inspire me, building teams where we get to take on what I think of as really exciting projects. I get a huge amount of pleasure from then communicating them and the positive feedback loops that gives you, but that's secondary. Mm-hmm. So I certainly don't go into any of my projects motivated by the influence part. I do them because they're I always sort of think, what would I do if nobody ever knew?
Okay.
Because that really does allow you to focus on the performance aspects of it. But it does give huge fuel to my fire, and it always has done, the fact that I have a platform to be able to share these projects, share these amazing companies, share these. And I've been doing this for long enough to know that it does give me a huge amount of pleasure when people come back and say, what you did gave me the network or the quiet confidence or the ability to do this. And those sort of butterfly effects, if you like, of course, they're fuel to the fire. But if you go back to where I started when I was leaving university, I really did get into media as a way just to thank my sponsors. I had no ambitions at that point, at the age of 21, 22, to have a media career. Mm-hmm. And I was a homeschooled kid who was not particularly sociable in the playground, was not sort of an alpha, loud kid who was a natural communicator. So you're asking how I've changed. I think that's the aspect within me that's changed the most over the last 20, 25 years. The fact that starting from my work with David Peat, learned this great love for storytelling. And whilst I'm fiercely busy with projects that I'm passionate about, I hope that by communicating those projects, it gives a much, much wider audience the quiet confidence to, I'm not coaching, I'm not telling people how to live their lives, but I hope that by sharing these conversations, I'm giving people the quiet confidence to prioritize things in their lives that maybe aren't, or taking ideas and thinking about them slightly differently. And I could give you lots of daft examples where people have come back and said, I'll give you one. A lady got in touch with me about 6 months ago and said, I was inspired by your cycle around the world. I wanted to cycle around the world, but my parents were against the idea. And so I put a notice out on social media to say that I want to cycle around the world, but I didn't know where to start. And somebody got in touch and said, I've got the same dream. Why don't we meet for a coffee and chat about it? Long story short, they ended up cycling around the world together, and they're now getting married. Wow. And she wanted to tell me that this had happened. She had cycled the world and she'd met her life partner. And, you know, I don't do anything in my world because I think that I'm going to create those butterfly effects. Mm-hmm. But of course, it gives me a huge amount of pleasure when people take the time to get back in touch and say that something along the way influenced their choices in life, that it was their time, their commitment, their ideas that made it happen. But something in our worlds interacted, which created an outcome that wouldn't have happened otherwise. Of course, I love that.
Yeah, that's an unbelievable story. That's so cool. My brother and I were joking around. I was saying, what should I ask Mark? He's like, has he got any advice for when you tell your wife that we're going another 4-hour run and that we're going to be leaving the kids? But on a serious note, like how important Nikki being and the role she plays, because you see the documentaries that sometimes she's sat in the support vehicle, and you know the role that she's played, and now you've obviously got, you know, 2 young girls as well. But talk to her in that aspect as well, because you're leaving home for a long time in some of these endurance expeditions. But yeah, the role she plays.
Family, or I mean, you don't have to be married, but family or close friends around a career are really important. Really, really important. I've been fortunate throughout my adult life that I've had a small number of friends who I sort of jokingly call my unofficial, unpaid non-execs. Mm-hmm. So they know who they are, but people who I'll pick up the phone to or go for lunch with and think out loud around really tough decisions. Mm-hmm. I've lent on them quite a lot in the last year, and I'm hugely grateful for their time and experience. And they're not people who can do what I do, but they're people who I really respect in terms of their thought processes and their experiences and their ability to listen and feedback. So yeah, there's 3 people in particular throughout my adult life, and I've made a conscious effort to thank them, but also to make time for that, because you cannot, if you're going to have a really ambitious career and not live life in cruise control, you need people to be able to sort of take an interest in what you're doing, mm-hmm. to support you when you're finding it tough. And then when it comes to family, there's a million different ways of structuring family. People often say, well, you need to have common interests and you need to be able to... Nikki and I have almost nothing in common. Wow. Nikki and I met the old-fashioned way. I was writing my first book in a local pub in Edinburgh, and she was the barmaid. Mm. If we were modern meeting on online dating, this whole idea of matching interests, we would have never met, because there's almost nothing in my world and her world that overlaps. But it works. It works. She's incredibly supportive of what I do. I'm hopefully supportive in what she does, but I have to acknowledge that being an athlete and entrepreneur, you do have to have a selfish trait. You have to be able to really get the blinkers on, as you've spotted in the documentaries. So I'm not convinced it would work if we were wired up exactly the same. Yeah. I hope that I support her, but to give her credit, I think she has adapted more to who I am than the other way around. I'm the one that always goes away, and I think it's harder to be left than to leave. So she is hugely supportive, understanding, and is always there for me. I think if she was competing for the same space, if she was taking the same level of entrepreneurial risk, mm-hmm. if she was having to train and commit the time that I do, I think that would be difficult. Yeah. She's an educator, she's a teacher, she's an artist, she's a mother, she works incredibly hard. But if she was off doing 4-hour training rides and taking some of the financial and entrepreneurial risks that I do, mm-hmm. I don't think in our household that would work. I'm not suggesting it couldn't work elsewhere, but I think our strength is our differences.
Yeah, it's powerful. It's really good. So now you have moved. I know you've always, through the course of your career, dipped in and out of broadcasting and business, but probably a little bit more so in the last few years, you've really made a move from, I guess, the bike to business and the boardroom. I'm intrigued to kind of understand from the core principles from endurance sport and what you've done there, how they've transferred into the business world that's kind of set you up for success, and maybe some of the challenges that come from that as well.
And you know quite a lot of people who have transferred from athletic careers, sporting careers into business, including through 𝘙𝑗. And it's always a challenge because you've got a lot to give in terms of teamwork and work ethic. The wonderful thing about sport is you can't lie in sport, you can't spin it in sport. You're either doing it or you're not. Everyone can see it. In business, in love, in every other aspect of your life, there's a version of what you're doing. There's what you're doing, and then there's what you tell the world. Sport's very naked in the fact that it's very clear whether you're doing it or not.
Yeah.
So I think athletes who come into the business world find it a bit strange, the fact that there's the truth and then there's the story you tell, whereas in sport there's just the truth.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd say that the same exists in relationships and love. You know, how close are you to that truth, or is it just, are you showing up and going through the motions? And showing up and going through the motions happens in the workplace all the time, whereas it doesn't happen in sport. You know, in sport, there's a as I say, there's a rawness to it.
Yeah.
So you can take a lot of the discipline and the process and the team into the work environment, but most athletes struggle with the sheer imposter syndrome of feeling like they've spent, 5, 10, 15, 20 years doing something else, and they're behind the curve on a lot of the technical skill sets that it takes to then do whatever else that other people are doing. So I think a lot of athletes think, same as military, they think, well, how do I catch up? And that's the wrong way of thinking about it, because you'll never catch up. Life is not a race. Life is not about beating other people at what they do. Be valued because of who you are, not because of what you do. Yes, you need to learn the technical sides of the job. Yes, you need to understand the rules of the game. But to be effective in the workplace doesn't mean you need to be better than the person that's been doing that specific job for 15 years already. And I think if you can get away from that linear way of thinking about work and think more broadly about what you can bring, what value you can bring, I think athletes can do phenomenally well in the workplace. I've been the partner of an early stage investment fund for the last 5 years. I've stepped back from it now to focus on other parts of my portfolio. But I was the youngest.
Where?
And we were a science technology fund. I'm not a scientist or technologist.
No.
And I'm certainly not an accountant or a lawyer. So on paper, I was the least experienced person from the team.
Mm-hmm.
Did I add value over 5 years? Absolutely. We took the business from here to here, leveraging the skill sets and the network that I've got. And I'm incredibly proud of that. But I often sat in the boardroom at people who were older and had more industry experience than I did, thinking, what can I bring? What can I bring that's distinct and different, as opposed to, should I try and become the people around the boardroom? And I think that's always the challenge for people who live their lives in chapters. If you've done something else with your life, how do you add value without just trying to assimilate people around you?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, really good. What's again, I've got to know you a little bit over the last few months, and I know you've kind of talked about a lot today around purpose, and I know now looking forward, you talk a lot around that, and you're truly passionate. You're a huge, patriot as well, and proud of Scotland and want to give back. Looking ahead now to the next few chapters of your journey, what's going to really kind of be the measurement of success in your mind?
We live in a really interesting period of history, and it's very hard to see that objectively when you're in it. Yeah. If you think the way the world looked in the 80s when we were born, and then the geopolitics through the 90s, and looking back to actually a period of relative stability, technology, education, what young people are being educated for in the future workforce, the role of government, how we think about skill sets within business, society versus government. What do we want that relationship to look like within Scotland, within the UK, within the world? That's a lot, what I've just said. But the question is always, but what can I do? And of course I'm interested in those, concentric circles, starting from my own family, the community I'm a part of here in Edinburgh and Scotland, the world.
Mm-hmm.
But you've got to be relevant to stuff within the short amount of time that we've got. Mm-hmm. So there's no point in just being all sort of theoretical and macro about it. You've got to be very purposeful about what are you specifically going to do about it. So I've been very passionate over the last 5 years to build an engine room for early stage science and technology in Scotland. Great, fantastic. I'm very, very interested in what happens in Scotland and globally over the next 25 years, which realistically is sort of my working career. And then beyond that, my daughters and wider family. So what can I specifically do each year, which is, I can't be effective to any of these things if I'm not healthy, happy, and productive. So how can I do stuff in terms of my own well-being, which is interesting? How can I stay physically active, mentally and physically? How can I be doing stuff each year which I find purposeful, and I get to do some of the communication sides of stuff which creates those externalities and ripples. But it can't just be coming on podcasts and talking about it. It's got to be at the coalface, doing stuff, building businesses, making connections, investing, buying businesses, thinking about where the value sits within those businesses to those that are not structured in the private sector way. So the third sector, the role of government and the rest of it. So I'm not planning to go into politics, but I do think deeply about how these things interact with each other. So if I care about global trends around healthcare and sustainability on planet Earth, what can I do on a micro level within the ecosystem that I exist in that can make a jot of difference to all of that? Am I pretending that I've got a magic wand that can fix any of these macro issues? Absolutely not. But most people just stop at that point and say, well, I can't do anything. You absolutely can, but you need to be very specific about how you take the time that you've got, the relationships that you've got, and do things that create those ripples which are beyond the work that you do yourself. So that's a very broad way of answering your question, which is I'll continue to be an athlete and take on interesting projects, which hopefully informs people to, the endurance podcast series, for example. That takes up a small amount of my time and I enjoy doing it. The business creation and how that interacts with the third sector and charities in Scotland, I think is really, really interesting. And then more broadly, how we make sure that the society we're a part of is sustainable. And I mean on the environmental side as well as the sort of the social contract side. It's very hard to sort of finish the conversation on that point. And clearly that is so expansive. And I only introduce these topics because, when I'm out on a bike or out on a run, this is how I think about things. And then it always comes back to okay, but what am I actually doing today that matters? And it's why I'm not going to sit around in projects which aren't making decisions and moving fast. And if you look at my career so far over the last 20 years, there's been a lot of successes, but there's been a lot of dead ends as well. My career has not been a straight line. I've yet to write a CV and apply for a job. I've not yet sat down, and I've always created opportunities through conversations that I've had with people, and nobody's found me out yet.
That's a good, the day you've got to do your CV, something's gone wrong. We're just going to finish up with a few quick fire questions. Not pressure to be too quick. But one thing I've wanted to do with this podcast is actually start it's the Leaders Unlocked library. So a book or a resource or a podcast that's maybe had a real impact on you that you'd like to recommend and to other people as well.
Big thought. Making time to read and listen. Podcasts are such an amazing way to get those long form conversations. I think it's so important. It informs your thinking. I mentioned the book I was reading at the moment earlier on in the conversation, but that's the one I would recommend right now, even though I can't remember the title, because that is all about this social contract. This is all about having the confidence to actually use your skill sets in a broader sense.
Are great leaders born, or can they be developed?
Great leaders are definitely developed. I think we're all born with a sense of curiosity and the ability to create surplus value. But that childhood ability to continue to imagine a better future, to build stuff, to build alliances, I think that you have to learn that.
Sure. If you could go for a coffee with one leader and pick their brains for a couple hours, who would it be and what would you ask?
I think the question most people would probably answer with Mandela or whoever your political heroes are. I think I'd quite like to sit down with Trump. And
I'd watch that podcast.
And try and understand some of the psychology and decision making. We live in extraordinarily interesting times. So to have the opportunity to sit down with a political world leader who, like Putin or Trump, and to really understand a completely different perspective, I would find probably more informative than meeting a political hero.
Yeah. Great. What's your most important non-negotiable as a leader?
Trust.
Great. What's one word that defines your leadership style?
The word that describes my leadership style is pretty hard to answer yourself. I think you'd probably have to ask my teams. What would my teams...
Yeah, well, that's one of my next questions. So what 3 words would your teammates, colleagues or counterparts use to describe Mark Beaumont?
I think Nicky would be a good person to ask this question. The way I would describe my leadership is... It's 2 words, but quiet confidence. Quiet confidence, as hopefully not arrogance, but the ability to back your own ideas.
Yeah, really good.
The way that I would imagine my teams describe my leadership is disruptive. Again, hopefully in a good way. Curious and relatively hands-off. I'm not a micromanager.
Yeah, great.
I'd say I would describe myself as an architect, not a builder.
When you're leading a team, which behaviour are you least tolerant of?
Faff.
Like that. I like that a lot. Who are 2 people that have had the biggest influence on you, both as a leader and a top performer, but also as a person?
Who's had the most influence on who I am?
Who you've become, yeah.
Una, my mum, as an educator. I don't agree with everything she's done, but she's been a huge part of my career, both as, in childhood and business. I've already mentioned David Peat. And these close friends and mentors, I won't name check them, but they know who they are. People who I've really sort of trusted and listened to over the years. So again, they're not public figures, but people who have really informed the decisions I've made.
Yeah.
And always been there to support me.
Brilliant. You've been in a lot of different expeditions, been a lot of part of different teams. What's the best team environment you've ever been part of and why?
I would say the best team environment I've been in, and this is not because I led it, is the 80 Days team. Laura Penhall, Mike Griffiths, the tens of people that worked with me on that 2.5-year project. I've worked with some amazing teams in business as well as in sport, but there is something about the level of commitment, time, effort, commitment, obsession that team put into that project. And there was some who left and found it too intense, but what a wonderful vision. To imagine going
unbelievable,
nearly 40% faster than anyone's ever done it before and to pull it off. I'm so proud of that team.
It's unbelievable. If you could have that 5-minute conversation with that 12-year-old Mark Beaumont that's about to cycle across the country, what would you say to him?
I think it's so important with children to not live your dreams through your children, to just let them be. I probably wouldn't say much to my 12-year-old self. I'd be scared to distract the 12-year-old Mark from the twists and turns of what lay ahead. I would hate to overawe, ego boost, distract from, what was going to happen next. I think it was a very organic, unpressured process.
Yeah.
As a 12-year-old, I'd love to meet my 12-year-old self, but I'd be worried that if I interacted, that you'd put pressure on that situation. And the opportunity I have had to learn, to grow in my teenage years, and then by the time I was 23, 24, take on my ultimate dream to pedal around the planet, was a very unpressured process.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a very self-driven process. There was no pushy parents. There was nobody on my shoulder saying, I want you to do this.
Yeah.
So I'd love to meet my 12-year-old self, but I'd be worried. I'd be worried to distract.
Yeah, it's a great answer. Very last question. What's the best piece of advice you've ever had that you can pass on to our audience?
Be valued for who you are.
Love
that for what you do.
Mark Beaumont, thank you very much.
Cheers.